up into two sections today where for the first half of the class, we're going to talk about a lot of the concepts we learned in that slave narrative PowerPoint, as well as the homework assignment. So we're going to open up and start with that. And the second half of class will deal more with a discussion of a slave narrative poem where we kind of get a chance to apply all of the concepts and ideas that we discussed today. So it's more learning in theory. Second part of class today is more practice. All right, so let me go ahead and pull up the assignment on which we're going to discuss today.
Miss Cole, I don't know if you got my email, but I was not able since like morning of Monday before class Monday to open up the icebreaker thing. And I know you said that you opened it, and even on the icebreaker it says due before class at 10 a.m. September 30th. It was still grayed out and it wouldn't let me open it to actually upload.
Okay. Next time you guys try to let me know like before we get here, because I think when you email, I did email back that I had opened it up and everything, but if from that you were still having trouble, then
Yeah, from that
yeah, it would
email
have
that you
really,
responded to me, I still had trouble.
okay, so I'll go back in and check that. We'll talk about that. Hold on, let me make a note of it. So that is with the welcome. Anybody else struggle to get access into the welcome video? I take that as perhaps a no. So, all right, Jayla, I'll put a note here and I'll follow up with you via email on that. All right. A couple of students coming back in. All right. Let me pull up the Brightspace assignment. All right, and again, I try to take it a little bit easy on us, especially due to the mishaps of Monday's class. So again, in addition to the documents in Module 2, main thing I wanted you guys to focus on for homework was the reading of the Francis E.W. Harper poem, A Song for My People. And students were asked to consider this poem, you know, based on the elements, based on what we learned about the slave narrative. So let's review a few things really quickly prior to opening up this discussion. Look, I'm going in just to be a little bit nosy. I checked it earlier, but I haven't checked it. All right, awesome. Okay, so we'll talk about these responses. Let me remind you guys of a few things that we learned on Monday, or at least that we reviewed on Monday. In looking at the Francis Harper poem, I really wanted students to approach it from the understanding that we gathered on Monday about the slave narrative. So three specific areas: the purpose of the slave narrative, the elements of the slave narrative, and the themes explored in the slave narrative is how I really wanted you guys to consider the Francis Harper text. So let's just review that really quickly. With the slave narrative, we learned many things, but the purpose of the slave narrative we learned was to attempt to arouse sympathy in readers. So there is this awareness, this very consciousness of a reading audience, right? So a lot of what you will find in slave narratives is presented in a way to evoke sympathy in their readership and to also prompt their readers to action. So whether that's activism, humanitarianism, a main purpose of slave narrative was to arouse the sympathy of their readers. The slave narrative also works to emphasize traditional Christian religious beliefs. That's really important because one of the main publishers of slave narratives were the abolitionists, the Puritans. So a large part of the slave narrative was to promote those Christian religious ideals. So you guys will see those symbols and themes show up a lot. Another purpose of the slave narrative was to show acceptance of ideals of dominant whites. So again, keep in mind the intended readership. A lot of the slave narratives were published at a time when it was illegal for slaves to not only read, but to learn or pursue reading and writing. So again, there was an awareness that the reading audience was whites. So in order to persuade and convince them, there had to be some acceptance of those ideals and values shared by dominant whites. Another purpose of the slave narrative is it was to kind of show this picture that emphasizes the cruelty of the slave narrative. So there was a clear purpose with the slave narrative. It was to present slavery as evil, right? So the depictions of cruelty, shame, all of that is a part of the slave narrative. And again, here we see again, it targeted white audiences. So we see that about 2 or 3 times in considering the purpose of the slave narrative. So I want you guys to keep that in mind. Elements, I want you guys to explore the elements as well. So the elements of the slave narrative really speaks on this awareness of what it means to be a slave. So that's why the first-hand accounts, we talked about the slave narrative of Frederick Douglass. We talked about the escaped slave. Their first-hand account was really important in terms of, pushing this awareness, adding credibility to, this whole idea that slavery is evil. An element, again, of the slave narrative is an awareness of what it means to be a slave, and also this loss of innocence. Another element I want you guys to look for is the realization of alternatives to bondage and the determination to be free. So again, kind of pointing out or showing an audience that slavery is not the answer. There could be other alternatives, but the final determination is to be free. Again, an element that we see time and time again in the slave narrative is that of escape and freedom obtained. Okay, so we're going to explore that in that Frances Harper poem. Lastly, one thing I wanted you guys to stay mindful of as you read the poem were the themes that no matter when the slave narrative was written, no matter who wrote it, male or female, escaped slave, secondhand account, they almost always deal with the same themes, right? Always this overarching main point. And in the slave narrative, there is the theme of exposure to physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. So it's showing the negative impact of slavery, not just physically on the body, but also emotional as well. We also see in many slave narratives comparisons of slaves to other forms of life. So we see a lot of metaphorical language where the slave is oftentimes compared to animals, right? To kind of really point out or emphasize the, somewhat cruel and brutal treatment of the slave. We also see themes of this determination to read and write, to better oneself. There tends to also be communities that the slave narratives will operate in. So it's not just a lone slave. You see not only the main character, but also communities of slaves. So you can also see the impact there. And there's also the theme of loss, this destruction of family ties or family connection. So again, no matter what you're reading in terms of the slave narrative, we see these themes revisited time and time again. And I wanted us to take a look at that as we consider the Frances Harper poem. All right, so let's dig into that assignment. Started looking at the submissions that came in earlier today. I see a little bit more came in after I checked. So even though I'll kind of ask you guys how you responded, I do see your answers here as well. Okay, so hold on before I get deep into that. Let me pull up the questions for you. So as you guys could see from the assignment itself, I did my best to try to guide you through the reading. So let me pull that up. I just want to go right back to those assignment guidelines. It's not letting me view it. So I think students were asked to respond in 1 to 2 paragraphs. I think that was the parameters that I gave. And students were asked to read according to the critical reading skills we've discussed in class, according to the habits covered in the handout, notes on how to read African American literature. But I also wanted you guys to look at specific questions as well. We know it's really important to consider the author when we are reading anything, any literature really, but especially African American literature. So I asked you guys, who is the author? What is their purpose? What historical event is the author responding to? What symbols or meanings can you derive from the text? And how do you relate to or connect with the text? So even though I threw these questions in to kind of help guide you through the critical reading process, it's one that I'm hoping you guys are making a habit out of every time you encounter a text. This is the process that I'm taking this reading through. Before I really dive into it, let me first of all investigate what I'm reading, who wrote it, what's their purpose, who is the intended audience. When you begin with those preliminary questions, you'll be surprised to find out what is revealed, as you are reading the actual text. So it's always a good place to start. The students answered the question, what specific elements from our discussion of the slave narrative did you recognize in this poem? So let me pull up the poem. And as I'm pulling this up, can someone share with me, what did we find out about Frances E.W. Harper? What do you guys, based on your own reading, your own investigation, what do we know about Frances E.W. Harper?
I found out that she was born in Baltimore, and she was born into free African American parents.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of took that as they say that this poem or whatever this poem was published in 1895.
Mm-hmm.
It's what it said it was published, and like 20 years before that, a couple years before that, slavery was abolished and the
Right.
Civil War ended. So I just feel like she's been, in the North, and she's been living as a free African American. I feel like there was, because of Jim Crow laws and all the oppression and violence that was going on, that people were getting used to their new lives as not
Right.
being a slave, that
Mm-hmm.
she was kind of had the perspective of uplifting people, because
Mm-hmm.
she's been doing this all her life and it's new to these people that were just freed.
Mm-hmm. I like that. I like that whole
Oh, that was
breakdown.
good.
Yeah, that was good. Really good breakdown. A lot of things covered. When the poem is published, that's great context to consider, to kind of know what was going in the world, what was going on in the world at that time is really important, because as you pointed out, there was a certain hope that was being infused in the writing that reflects this. What was it, about 10 years or so, almost 20 years since the abolishment of slavery. So we can see that in this poem. We can see the hope, we can see the efforts, right? There's almost a blueprint. It seems almost that Francis Walker is attempting to lay out a blueprint of what we need to really do to, seize the moment. So absolutely, I'm glad you brought that up. You also brought up how she was born free. So she was born free to her parents, and that somewhat contradicts some of the elements, right, that we just discussed about the slave narrative. A lot of times, what you would get in the slave narrative is this firsthand account. And Frances E.W. Harper although she's credible because she does again come from this background of abolitionist, she grew up trained and educated in Christian or Puritan schools. So a lot of the content that normally goes in the slave narrative, Francis E.W. Harper is well versed on that. The religious manifests that are really seeking to, speak to our better senses, right? We see Francis Harper attempting to do that. So she has credibility, but I did think it was a little bit peculiar that she was born free, that she somewhat lived, as a privileged person at that time, right? She had had no experience with slavery other than witnessing, the horrors of it. She had aligned herself with the movement, right, with the abolitionist movement, whose main goal was to seek out, again, the improvement of former slaves. So we know that her cause is righteous, but she does kind of miss a couple of those boxes that we talked about, right? Um, so what were some things, just in considering the question, what were some things you guys noticed in the text that speaks directly to what we learned about the slave narrative? What were some elements as you were reading, you were like, that identifies one of the elements or themes of the slave narrative? What did you guys find? Here, and I'll pause my screen. Look, I'll go to your answers just in case. Look, to help stimulate discussion. So bear with me one second. But if you guys remember your answers, what do you remember that you identified in response to the question? What specific elements from our discussion of the slave narrative do you recognize in this poem? There are many different instances where almost every element of the slave narrative showed up. All right, I'll pull it up.
I feel like that she was real indirect about a lot of things. Like she didn't say slavery, she didn't say discrimination. She used other, terms to kind of describe that in a sense.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. She used more symbolic language. And keep in mind, one of the elements of the slave narrative is to appeal to a white audience. So you guys will see even now, but especially 10 to 20 years after, the emancipation of slaves, there was sentiment in the public to where they really didn't want to constantly go back, even though they were just coming out of slavery, even though, there were a lot of strides made by the government, the public in general, to transition, former slaves into society. I think there was a fatigue with the language at that time. And I think she is aware of the fatigue with that language. But, and I'm glad you brought that up too, this whole idea of the literal and figurative meaning in the text. So even though she may not have mentioned slavery directly, right? She made many, allusions to it. But I do agree too that I think her main tone, what she really wanted to do was to be hopeful, right? To kind of chart a new path. So even though there's an awareness of slavery in the text, I think it was deliberate. I think it was really intentional, her leaving out, the use of the word or directly calling out slavery. But here, let me see what you guys have.
I felt like she was appealing to the reader's emotions, because she just kept saying words like weary and battle cry, and till their hearts relax their tension and stuff. But I also feel like she kind of used children, because I think children, when she said, let me sing to the children before their footprints stray. I feel like, you know, children is everyone's soft spot if you
Yeah.
don't care about anything else. And I think that if you like, it's very, the footprints are very symbolic because I think footprints is symbolic to their innocence. I think when children are very young, they do not understand everything that goes on in the world. And I
Mhm.
think at the time things are so like everything is thrown in their face. Like obviously, you know, we're not we're not being treated as equal, but they don't have the pressure in their mind and in their hearts that it's really as bad as
Right.
as you know what it is. But as
Yeah.
their mind and as they mature and develop, they have to mature more before anybody else. Like they're not allowed to be kids more
Right.
quickly because
Yeah.
they see everything that's going on and they really take into account that that's their life and it's not fair, and that's when their footprint starts to stray, when their innocence goes away.
Right, right. Oh, I'm so glad you pointed to that specifically because yeah, that aligns with one of the elements we talked about, this element of loss of innocence. So she directly mentions that, and there's too an awareness that everything isn't as it should be, right? We know that we've come a long way, there's still a long way to go. So I kind of feel that in the language, but I definitely agree with you there, Jayla, that she's sending out an uplifting, a positive message. She is, even though she's not making direct reference to the institution of slavery itself, we're very clear on what she is, referring to in terms of us moving out of, right? Hearts that will, relax their tension. Where you mentioned too, Jayla, like the weariness, right? That's coming from that experience with that past of slavery. So we do see that there. She also talks about, you mentioned this to Jayla, um, new struggles, right? Um, that you have to kind of be mindful of. So again, where the slave narrative um, focuses on these elements of struggle, overcoming struggle, right? Trials and tribulations. Um, we see all of that at play in this poem. The fact that the poem is called Song for the People, right? Where we learned that the slave narrative really pulls from, biblical references, how it fashioned itself after, scripture, or that there's always a moral to the story. When I looked at the title, Song for the People, I thought immediately of, the Song of Psalms, right? Books of scripture that utilizes this, poetic, melodic form that uses, again, that symbolic language, those signs that still help to, make a valid point. So we definitely see that. Really good point you made, Jayla. I have you pulled up, so I wanted to just see before I close out. Anything else I wanted to add? Okay, and again, I like what you said about the children, very intentional. Like you said, there is an audience they're mindful of. And while you may not care about me so much, right? Think of the children. And I did see that she played that very well, not played it. I don't want to treat it like it's a game. It's very serious what was happening. But I do like that again, she's adhering to those elements, those strongholds of the slave narrative. All right, so let me go back. Oh, look, I messed my share all up. All right, so let me see what someone else has to add. Not to put you guys out there, it's just me. Again, I told you I'm nosy. I can't help it. Okay, good. So reading what Robin said, she made it clear that her songs was not about war, carnage, or strife. That could be, again, another reason why she stayed away from that language of all of those kind of hurtful and oppressive elements of history, and only focused on moving forward, moving upward. So again, you said that the songs are about happiness, peace, rest, abundance of life. This particular poem, and even what you pulled out of that reading, Robin, is the calling card of African American literature in general. The birth of African American literature with the early emergence of the slave narrative was to give hope, was to speak to triumphing over tribulations and hard times. So even just in the fact that she is writing to uplift, writing to give peace and happiness, even the fact that she's doing that alone, she's adhering to the theme of the slave narrative. That again is one of its main purposes. So you said she referred to slavery as a fever. That's good in terms of something else we'll talk about today too, figurative and literal meaning, right? So we know when we can talk about slavery literally, but in the poem, she definitely made figurative, references. So again, you pointed out, Robin, talking about slavery as fever, this illness of life. That's exactly how the slave narrative attempts to present slavery, as this horrific and almost uncivilized ill of life. So good. I'm glad you saw the symbols, the connection she made between that and slavery. She talked to, Jayla mentioned how she talked about children. She also talked about the elders, the ancestors. Really important in African American literature is always a nod to the ancestors. So the fact that we are talking now about the slave narrative in a contemporary African American course is that nod to the ancestors. It is almost with each movement that you guys will learn about in this class, there was always this kind of passing of the baton from one group to the next. So it's not by mistake, I think, that in this poem, Frances Harper focused on the children, because the youth are normally always the ones who spark revolution, who spark change. Look, I'm just getting a sidebar. If you guys even look at what's going on around us, around the world, all summer, we witness social justice protests. We witness all types of social changes being made, social issues being addressed. That was ushered in by the youth. The younger generation are always the ones who normally carry that hope, who again bring about revolution. But the elders are normally who you do it for. So she's very mindful to bring those two symbolic characters together in the poem. I like that. This poem reminded me that the elder had no rest and their children probably didn't get allowed to play all day. Okay, that's good. All right, let me look at one more or a couple more before kind of picking up the discussion on figurative and literal meaning in the text. Let me see. See if this will let me look it up. Now they, okay. Okay, good. I like this, Tasha. You pointed out specifically the elements you identified in the text. You identified escape and realization. I like that. You talked about how she wanted to end war. Again, I see that you all noticed that she opens up the poem by saying, this is not going to be about war. This is not going to be a battle cry type of song. That's not what I'm doing today. So you guys noticed that. She was writing this song for peace, for the young people, for old people. And in doing so, you notice that theme of survival, Tasha. So you point out the themes of survival. Absolutely. Is again, triumph over tribulation. That is a direct connection to survival, right? Making it in spite of. And the poem celebrates that. It not only acknowledges that how long or how far that the battle for emancipation had taken, but also an awareness of what it is to look forward to. So again, we see that. You said she talks about sorrow, pain, war, and crime, and wanted to make peace in the world. The purpose of the poem is to target African Americans and white. I definitely agree with that. I also want to say too, I wonder too if she's also imploring to other would-be writers. What do you guys think about that? We talk about literal and figurative meanings, but let's think about the meaning of the word songs, right? The title, Song for the People. If we think literally about what the word song means, right? We think about, ballads, verse, um, the telling of a story through music. That's normally what a song is, right, you guys? Like, do we agree with that? There's so many different genres of music because they tell different stories. So I think when she talks about song for the people, she's speaking symbolically about, I want to encourage, I want to uplift, I want to evoke feelings of peace and happiness. But is there also a figurative meaning that is, behind the lines, if we're reading between the lines, where they're talking too about this need of producing, songs for the people. So not just her song for the people, but the need in encouraging songs for the people. Like, do you guys know what I mean when I say that? Look, does that make sense? Let me pull the poem back up. But does anyone feel that we could take the word song to mean literally, word and verse, stories put to music? And also, could we look at songs for the people as in inspiration with this particular forum, with writing, with literature, the hope too of what getting those stories out could do to uplift and to kind of bring peace. Did anybody kind of look at or consider it that way when you think of songs? Look, does that make sense? Let me share my screen.
I think the rhythm of the rhyme itself was in an uplifting, peaceful beat, like
I
it,
do
like
too.
the I don't know, what do you call it? Not the ballad, but the way that something rhymes in a certain beat, it was very more uplifting than a sad song.
Yeah, yeah. You felt the energy in it. I
Yeah.
absolutely did too. Definitely agree with you on that. And just if we look at that opening stanza, right? Let me make the songs for the people. So just in saying, let me make the songs for the people. Well, is she making an actual song? You know what I mean? If we look at it literally, what she's really doing is she is making a symbolic meaning there. So let me make the songs for the people. That's an acknowledgement as her role of a writer. And not only just a writer, but also her intent or her purpose in writing. She's writing to uplift the people. And I think in that opening stanza again, let me read. Let me make the songs for the people, songs for the old and young, songs to stir like a battle cry wherever they are sung. So she's saying songs literally, but symbolically, I am making the connection, and this may just be me, but I'm making the connection. Songs are stories. So she's saying, let me make stories for the people, old and young. So I need to be telling the stories of the old and telling stories for the young. Um, Songs that will inspire. See how she said songs to stir like a battle cry, to inspire people wherever they're, and look, and I'm going to say read or sung. So it could maybe just be my obsession with, literature, with reading. So maybe I just hold these ideas in my head all the time. But I'm thinking when she looks at or considers the songs that she's making, she's speaking literally, but she's also speaking figuratively. The songs that she's referring to is the work, the writing, the stories, right? Which is what songs are. And she's saying she's not writing these stories to tell, war stories, or to only talk about the ills of life. I also want to talk about songs that thrill the hearts of men and inspire them, to a more abundant life. So even the figurative meaning behind the words support the elements that we covered of the slave narrative. We talked about it wanting to give hope. We talked about it also wanting to show that certain ideals, that we share as human beings, as citizens, certain ideals. So I like the whole idea about kids, the whole idea about wanting a more abundant life, wanting, peace and to be okay. I definitely see her making the connections with that. So with that being said, let me kind of make sure I'm not going on and on myself. You guys know I tried. Those of you who had me, my excitement level with literature. So I sometimes have to slow myself down so that we can I can make sure we cover what we need to cover. So one thing, let me stop share, that I definitely want you guys to be mindful of as we are learning more about not only the slave narrative, but also the African or contemporary African American lit, is the separation between literal and figurative meanings. Sorry, look, I had it. Here it is right here. All right, let me share my screen. This is somewhat of a basic breakdown. I know you guys are familiar with literal language and figurative language, but just to review and remind you guys, there is no right or wrong way to read literature, but there are two main ways to consider when you are reading it. You want to consider it, yes, in some cases, literally. So I'm looking at every word and I'm applying every word as it is intended. But you also want to be mindful that just like, slaves who worked in the fields used to send messages by singing spirituals or gospel in the fields, they were sending a symbolic message that, because they were aware of the listening audience, they had to hide that message between the lines. So I do want to let you guys know that even though the slave narrative, it is clearly intended for a white audience, there were also symbolic meaning behind the words, where the authors a lot of times would make winks and nods to a reading African American audience as well. So I want you guys to think about the idea that, yes, I can take it one way, but there's also an additional meaning that I can pull from this text. And that's what we call that figurative meaning. So when you think of literal meanings, right, we could have looked at, again, let's use the word song for my people. We could look at song as being, again, literally a song, or we could look at it as being stories, right? We could look at it more than one way. So where we just talked to about her emphasis on children and older people, or we can look at that literally, or we could look at it symbolically or figuratively, with she's doing something specific in mentioning the youth or children. She's doing something specifically when she mentions our elders, right? So an awareness that there is a movement between the literal and figurative always taking place in African American literature. Listen, always taking place. Even when you think it isn't, it's always happening. So let's again look at this really quickly. So literal descriptions, again, the grass looks green. Based on my literal definition of green, literally I know how to take this information. Now, where we say the grass looks like spiky green hair, well, now I get a little bit more of an image. I get a vivid picture. Now those words are attached to a image in my mind. And when you think of figurative meaning, you're always thinking of your imagination. You're thinking of how these words produce an image in your head. So we went from grass looks green to the grass looks like spiky green hair. And you guys will see figurative language takes on many different forms. So here you see the simile, which again is this comparison. I'm taking a literal term and actually comparing it to something symbolic or meaningful. So the simile, anytime you see the word like, there is always this process of making a comparison, a connection between one object and another. So we have grass looks like hair. So the object of grass being compared to the object or being compared to hair. Sand feels rough. Very literally, if you were to touch sand, you may define it as rough. So this is literal meaning. But let's look at figurative meaning. Sand is solid water. So this is a metaphor, similar to analogies. They're again attempting to make a comparison. So we could talk literal, sand feels rough, or the comparison here is that sand is solid water. Now, I won't even tell you what that metaphor means. I'm not sure. Maybe that's a scientific metaphor. But again, there's always a need to explore and look at those meanings, those figurative meanings, shall I say. Another example, the flower smells sweet, literal, clearly defining or identifying how the flower smells. Now let's look at the figurative statement. The flower has the sweetest smelling petals in the world. So it smells sweet, but how about it doesn't just smell sweet, it's the sweetest smelling in the world. So that's hyperbole. So figurative meaning takes on many different terms too. You guys will hear me talk about metaphor. What's the metaphorical meaning? And that is, again, it's comparison, matching one object or drawing a connection or a line between one object and another. Simile, anytime you see like or as, you know you are looking at figurative language. Hyperbole, the tallest, the greatest, the best, right? Anything that adds an extreme, that's hyperbole. That's figurative meaning. Grasshoppers are fiddlers who play their legs. Well, we know grasshoppers don't technically play their legs, but what they're doing is they are taking something literal like legs, and they are applying a figurative meaning to something musical like a fiddle. So again, it's always this way of the meaning hiding in the language. So even though I know you guys did really well with the Francis E.W. Harper poem, I want to quickly go right back to it, because now that we've talked about this figurative and literal connection, I want to see what may be some others that we pick out in this text. And we're just going to do this really quickly just to kind of see. If you guys kind of identified or witnessed any figurative meaning in the text. And you guys talked about it already. I think when I read Robin's, Jayla's, I think I heard from Jalea too. I think I did, you guys. If I'm identifying the wrong person, please forgive me. But based on this poem and based on what we just talked about with figurative meaning, did you guys notice any other moments in the poem where the author is making some type of hidden or symbolic meaning in the text? Do we see any instances of, let's say, metaphor or simile or analogies? I don't know if you guys are looking at it in my screen or in your own screen. I'm sorry if I'm looking for words like, because I know here it is. Look, I went back to that first stanza. Songs to stir. look at where it says songs to stir like a battle cry. So songs to stir like a battle cry. Figurative meaning. I want to write songs or stories. Look, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. But let's say that she's saying I want to write stories that stir or inspire like a battle cry, right? So she's again making that direct comparison there. Staying away from war, but saying it's, you know, it's like it. I want you to have that same intensity, right? Okay, let me see if I see another. And if you guys think of any or see any, just throw them out at me. Okay, so it may not be that many there. That's okay. That's all right. We have another poem that we plan to take a look at and get a little bit more practice with figurative and literal meaning. But make sure you guys are mindful of that. A lot of the literature that we'll read in the class, when you guys are asked to read, now a lot of the literature, now that won't mean that when you read Christina Sharp or Ta-Nehisi Coates, it's not to say that they may not employ symbolic language or figurative meaning, but you will definitely find it in poetry. You'll definitely find it in literary fiction, right? So a lot of what we'll read in the class, you guys will need to do double duty. I'm doing literal reading as well as figurative reading or symbolic reading. All right. Keeping that in mind. Again, the importance of the slave narrative. Well, I guess I'll let you guys help me with that. So in our review of the slave narrative and kind of taking a look at the sample, and this is only one sample, we're going to look at a couple more with the Frances E.W. Harper poem. What would you guys say, if asked, is the significance of the slave narrative? Like, where does it fit in, let's say, the literary tradition? Where does it fit in the culture, right? What do you guys think is the significance of the slave narrative? Why is it important? And it's no right or wrong. I'm just asking, what do you guys just think? You know, what conclusions can you draw with that?
I would say when you spoke about it being primarily for a white audience, just to persuade them over, to get some white people on their side.
Right. I like that, Robin. So saying that it was more to prompt people to action, right? To what did it say the purpose was? About a humanitarian effort, right? So you see the significance of the slave narrative being, you know, this movement that's prompting change. It was the first opportunity to really directly address a white audience, to get an opportunity to educate them and inform them on what life is like. So it's significant, definitely, you know, in the way that you mentioned, Robin, that it was intentional in bringing about change. And that change was not only, you know, bringing about a change in the ending of slavery, because we see with Frances Harper writing this or publishing this in 1895, the slave narrative endured beyond the emancipation of slavery. So those ideals of appealing to a white audience, prompting them to see, you know, things as they are, and to persuade them to, you know, do the right thing or to be that good Christian, right? So it's significant in that. Yes, definitely targeting change. Absolutely. What else? What else did you guys want to add to that? The significance of the slave narrative. Well, it's okay. Look, there's no right or wrong, but I'm gonna take my cue from the silence. That one thing that I want you guys to do, if you feel like you're unsure on what the significance of the slave narrative is, not just to the writing, you know, or the African American literature in general, but what the slave narrative did is it ushered in the vernacular tradition, or it introduced the world to what is now known as African American or Black culture. So the slave narrative is one of the earliest documents, one of the earliest evidence that you can point to and show African American. I'm going to say African American culture because it's uniquely American, right? So we just talked about the slave narrative. We talked about Frances E.W. Harper, how she stated in her poem that I'm not going to talk about war or slavery or anything sad. I'm here to uplift and give peace, right? Well, if it began with that, just look at what followed, right? What do you guys think that church songs are? Blues, gospel, hip hop, sermons, oral tradition. It all has its early roots in the slave narrative. Just look at what we learned were the purpose of the slave narrative. It is, again, or shall I say the elements of the slave narrative, to this loss of innocence, this awareness of what it means to be a slave, or this awareness that I'm in a really peculiar place with peculiar things happening around me, right? We see that in, any gospel hymn you hear, right? It's always about, like Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me, right? There's always this realization that even though it's hard, right? I once was lost, but now I'm found. This whole idea of escape, this whole idea again of overcoming, dark times and hard situations, this realization and determination to be free, right? We see that in the music we listen to every day, right? Do you guys agree with that? So even though the slave narrative, you guys just mentioned when we read Frances Harper, how it kind of read, it had like a upbeat tempo to it. It had the rhyme pattern and the verse phrasing of a song. When you think of things that are uniquely a part of the African American tradition or the African American vernacular, which is just another way of saying the culture, right? When you think about that, just know how almost everything derived from gospel, almost everything derived from the blues, almost everything derives from jazz. So those early elements of the Black vernacular or African American culture came from, were not necessarily influenced by, but yes, influenced by the slave narrative. The slave narrative holds those exact same elements. There was an awareness that there's an audience that they had to appease and appeal to, but that is why, again, that figurative and symbolic language. A lot of times in gospel, you can think that it may be about one thing, but a lot of times they would use, again, those spirituals, those gospel songs to let slaves know the route that they would be taking, in their efforts to escape, or where the Underground Railroad will be meeting. They put signs in those songs, right? Whether it's gospel songs or what they call their work day songs. What was hidden and infused in it was this determination to be free, this determination to escape, this determination to overcome, right? So significance, definitely what I want you guys to make note of, significance of the slave narrative is that it ushered in, it is what prompted African American culture. It started with the slave narrative. It has since taken many different forms. You guys saw where I just mentioned the blues, hip hop, jazz. Well, when we talk about gospel, we know that jazz and the blues were derived from gospel, and then from that, R&B was derived from jazz and the blues, and then from that, hip hop emerged. But it still kind of follows this thread of telling stories. It still follows this thread of an awareness of how hard or how difficult life may be for that, marginalized person or group, right? So again, everything that we talked about in terms of purpose, elements, and themes of the slave narrative, they are the elements and themes that creates, ushered in, again, Black vernacular, Black tradition, African American culture, all began with the slave narrative. So even though the slave narrative is written, even though we consider it in terms of publication, a lot of these same stories were shared orally. So when you think of Frances Harper and the poem Songs for My People, and you are aware of how it sounds when you, let's say, recite it out loud, right? There again is this connection to the oral tradition. It's a connection to those stories that were usually shared in oral tradition. Again, always connecting back, always nodding back to the, ancestors, the past, right? So that's important to keep in mind. There's plenty of time for me to get carried away, so I'll wait on that. But in speaking about that, look, do I want to move right on to, all right, I'm going to put a pin in what I just stated because I definitely need to come back to that. There's always this nod to the past, because that's really important to know as you guys are working on and reading the Christina Sharp chapter. Have you guys had a chance to get started on reading this? Chapter 1? And if not,
Yeah.
I'll say it's okay, and I'll try to mean it. But it's okay if you haven't. It's almost kind of okay if you haven't, in that I would like to set this chapter up. So let me kind of help you guys make sense of what it is you'll be encountering with this chapter 1 text. So again, I think I asked a question, but I didn't listen for the answer. Have we started reading that chapter 1 called The Wake? Okay, not yet. Okay, that's okay. All right. Everything that we just talked about in terms of figurative and literal language, consider that when you're reading chapter 1. Because Christina Sharp, the fact that she titles chapter 1 The Wake, that is no accident. And she spends the entire chapter breaking down what the wake means. So I'm hoping that as you guys read this chapter, you walk away with an understanding of what the wake is. And she breaks it down using 4 concepts, 4 specific concepts. So again, really make sure when you guys are reading, you're paying attention to that. All right, so when she talks about the wake, we talked about literal and figurative meaning. Are you guys familiar with the term the wake? When you hear that term, what do you think of? The wake. And there's no right or wrong answers, just name association. When you
Where's
hear,
my notes at?
yeah.
Because I liked how she kept changing, or how it kept evolving
Yes.
as I was reading.
Yeah.
Wake, it started as one thing, and then it got deeper and deeper.
Yeah.
I only read about 15 pages of it. What did I write?
Okay, well that's good, because I can tell you are paying attention, Robin. It is. She's taking us through steps. So she starts out first looking at and considering the wake one way. So she gives us several different ways of looking at it. So again, the literal, the wake, she lays out a definition of that. So again, literal and figurative. The metaphor, and there's that word, figurative meaning, the language that Christina Sharp uses is that of a ship. I want you guys to think of, in history, what a ship means, especially to descendants of slaves, the transatlantic slave trade, right? So think of a ship, right? She begins putting us in this mindset of a ship. So she uses literal language when referring to the various parts of the ship. So she opens up by talking about the wake. There is a portion of the ship, or there is what the ship normally leaves behind. And do you guys know if you've ever stood on, look, I'm sorry, my son is really bumping his TV, so I'm sorry if you guys are struggling to hear me. But have you guys ever, let's say, been on a cruise or been on, let's say, one of the boat rides over at Navy Pier? But as you guys are leaning over the side of the boat, you notice that that boat leaves waves left in the water, you know, to kind of, there's a sign that that boat is moving by the wake or the little ripples and waves that are left behind. Do you guys notice that or see that when you are on a boat or have been on a boat? Look, do I sound crazy? Do you guys know what I mean when I say this idea of being on a boat? I'm thinking of a cruise because I really wish I was on a cruise. But you're on the boat and you're kind of, let's say, looking over the back of the boat, right? And you can kind of see the rotors as the boat is moving. It's leaving these ripples and, you know, almost footprints in the water, right? Do you guys know what I'm talking about when I say that?
Yeah.
Yeah. I want you to think about the wake one way, literally like that. It is what remains after the ship has sailed. It's all about what remains is when we look at the wake. So the sign or the symbol that the boat or that movement even took place is in those ripples and in those waves that follow a boat. Long after the boat has passed, you will normally see movement in the water that showed evidence that something happened here. You know, something has moved here, right? So she begins with this analogy. She uses the ship as a metaphor for this idea of the wake. So I want you guys to be mindful again of that literal and figurative when you read that, because it may feel a little bit confusing if you're not, you know, aware of the move she's making with literal meaning of the wake and figurative meaning. So when we talk about slave narrative and we look at how the past influences or impacts the future, we can think of the wake, right? We can think of the ripples, the little small disruption in the water as a ship passes by. That's what she is referring to as life of the African American. We're kind of living in the shadow of or in the ripples of the wake, right? Slavery, even though it may be centuries ago, there still is residue. There's still that footprint. It's still trauma that can be tracked to that movement, right? So she opens up with that and she breaks it down in 4 categories. So she talks about the wake first by comparing it to life. So pay attention to how she breaks down the wake, and that is this consciousness of us being the remnants of the past. So there's an awareness of that. So there's life. How do we live with a, shall we say, traumatic, complicated past? How does one live in that shadow? So she talks about that. She also talks about then what the wake looks like in death. So there's a metaphor that she discusses when we are, especially in African American culture, but I know this is true in a lot of other cultures, also in Latin culture as well. There is what they call the wake. You guys know the wake in terms of death. What is normally a wake when you are dealing with funeral arrangements? What does the wake symbolize in death, you guys? What do we know about wakes?
Like a celebration or of life or dedication to that person and the impacts that they made
Yep.
on the people that they love.
Yeah, that's good. That's it. That's exactly the spirit of the wake. The wake is us coming together to stand watch over this soul, right? And and again, it's of course celebrating them, um, sharing in the grief of the family, comforting each other. But again, in the text, Christina Sharp breaks it down in terms of it's where we come to um, watch over, kind of watch and make sure that our loved ones are transitioning safely. So the wake is normally where you would go to view, right, the body. This is where we go and kind of pay those last respects. So she breaks it down in terms of death. She also breaks it down in terms of trauma. So now that death has happened, so again, I'm not gonna give you guys too much too soon, but just again, a breakdown of that chapter. How then do you deal with what's left, right? How now do you deal with the trauma of that loss, right? So she talks about that. And she lastly talks about the wake in terms of silence. And specifically in terms of silence, it means kind of this, again, this idea of watching in expectation. So really important breakdown in this chapter that I want to make sure you guys don't miss is Christina Sharp's breakdown of the wake. And it's important in this chapter because every other chapter when she talks about the wake, this knowledge is needed for you to really kind of follow what she means by wake. Now, let's think of other words that come from our consideration of wake or being woke, right? So when I think of wake, and especially in connection with how Christina Sharp used it in this text, I think of she's also too talking about the burden of being woke. There's a burden of having a certain awareness and a certain consciousness. Once you now know your past and know what happened, and then are aware that a lot of those institutions that you thought had been knocked down and you thought had been abolished, that they're kind of still alive and kicking. When there's a certain wokeness that one operates out of, what that can mean too. So really good breakdown, again, all using this figurative and literal meaning of the word, the wake. And again, as you guys are reading it, she ends the chapter talking about wake work. So how it's everyone's responsibility to, once they, I don't want to say get woke, but once you have this awareness, once you operate from this place of awareness and determination, how to then do something with what you've learned. So what work will you now put in place, or will you commit yourself to improving or bettering, the situation? So a lot in this one chapter, but very, very important. So I'll let you guys read it for yourself. I'm a little bit excited about it. If you guys can see my pages in the text, it's, look, every other page is bent back. Every page is written on, underlined, or highlighted because she dropped a lot in this chapter. So make sure you guys are reading that this weekend. All right. Did you guys have any questions as I'm kind of transitioning to our quick exercise for today? All right. Hold on, let me pull up. So since we just were learning about the slave narrative and its significance, I'll pick it up from there. We talked about the significance of the slave narrative being that it ushered in, it made room for and space for Black culture. So with that, and when we think of Black culture, again, it can be encapsulated in oral tradition. And even though I may say gospel, blues, jazz, and hip hop, those are only vehicles. So those aren't the only manifestations of Black culture. So I want you guys to know that. Um, but they are vehicles, because in blues or rap or jazz and gospel, there is a language, that a vernacular that's picked up and reinfused in the community. There's so much more to culture. So with that being said, let me pull up this poem by Sterling Brown, and he's a really important contemporary writer. So he's a contemporary writer, but very conscious of the past and the role that the past played in not only influencing him as a poet, but also in what it played in the culture. So here's what I want you guys to do. I'm going to share this poem, the link for the poem, in our chat box. And it's a relatively short poem. I want you guys to read it. And as you're reading it, if you have like a notebook next to you or anything, jot down any notes, especially anything you notice in terms of the slave narrative. So if you see any elements, you see any themes at play, take note of that. If you also see any figurative meaning, so you see here where he may be playing with symbols or metaphors, I want you guys to make note of that as well. Okay, so just read it with that awareness, and then we'll come out on the other end, a couple of post-reading questions. All right, dropping this link in chat. And the poem is called Riverbanks Blues by Sterling Brown. So I just shared it. So again, let me reiterate, keep in mind what you guys learned about the slave narrative, any themes you see explored, but more importantly, I want us to look at the language used, figurative language, metaphors, anything. Make any notes of that, and we'll come out on the other end to discuss it. So I'm going to mute myself. I'll give us about a couple of minutes. Did everybody get an opportunity to access the poem?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. Aren't you guys? A little bit 2 minutes over. Um, but again, this is just an exercise in what we've learned and kind of talked about this week. So with the Sterling A. Brown's poem, I don't know if you guys are still reading. Look, are you still reading? Do we still need just a little bit more time to answer a couple questions? It's just a couple quick questions. Did you guys need a little bit more time? I'll assume no. I don't think we may need that much time. This again is a practice exercise. All right, so let's pull up the poem. Let me share the poem with you guys. And I know you guys may not have had a lot of time to do what we normally do when we read, where we do want to look at context, when it was written, who wrote it, what do we know, right? So I know all of that is an important part of the process. So look, I'm pulling up Sterling Brown just really quick in case you guys didn't get a chance to learn anything about him. Just something really quickly I can take away from what I read. So he's from Washington, D.C., so he's up north. You guys see he was born in 1901, so he's unique in his um, writing in that he comes from a time, 1901, where he may represent, let's say, that young child that Frances E.W. Harper was talking about in the poem, Songs for the People, that young person who, if she can just catch them before they get on that wrong path. Well, Sterling Brown, he's somewhat young enough where he could have been influenced by the poetry of a Frances E.W. Harper, influenced by the writing of Frederick Douglass and other slave narratives. So we know he has that back in terms of timeline. We have that context. We know that he's educated. He received his bachelor's degree. We also know that he studied the work of really what I call traditionalists. So the poets who really adhere to strict form, meter, rhyme, and verse. So he studied the well-known poets, Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, Robert Frost. He earned a master's from Harvard, so he has, and he taught at Howard. So, okay, so he has, credentials. I like to always see their contribution. So listen to this, look at this. It says his poetry was influenced by jazz, the blues, work songs, and spirituals. And he was also influenced by Langston Hughes, Gene Cole. Okay, so here's what I want you guys to really see. He was influenced by jazz, blues, work songs, and spirituals. Did you guys see any of that influence in his writing? Well, I guess the fact that it's called the Riverbanks Blues, right? The poem is called The Blues, right? So did you guys kind of see that in his format? Here's what we know. He's well versed on poetry, so he knows how to write poetry. He also knows how to write it traditionally, what's considered the right way. So what we see when we take a look at his poetry, and hold on, let me pull it up. We see that he knows the rules, but he's also playing within those rules. So he's pulling out the forms and formatting of blues, of music. So again, hold on, you guys, let me share my screen. Okay, so here's the poem again. All right, so here's what I wanted to ask you guys. As you were reading, you guys were asked to look at any connections that you can make to the slave narrative. Did you guys see any elements, themes that Sterling Brown talks about here, and that we also talk about as a theme in the slave narrative? Did you guys see any similarities between what we learned in slave narrative and what you saw here in Sterling Brown's poem?
I think the word lazy being said. Right here it says twice on your screen, but
Oh,
I
yeah.
think lazy is kind of like a manipulative word a little bit. It's kind of it's a demeaning word, but it's kind of manipulative because it's I don't know, when people call you lazy, it's not a good thing, but it literally means that you should do more or something like that. Like there's something more for you than what you're doing, and you're not doing anything. And then when it says that um in certain dialects that this is the way that life goes, it's kind of like something that's manipulating you to do something, you having like no power, or you don't have any I don't know what's the word, when you just can't, when you just are very discouraged into doing it because
Okay, yes.
that's you're
So,
just so used in your setting.
oh, okay. So kind of like stuck in your ways.
Yeah.
Okay, I like that. Oh, okay. Lots of things I saw in what you said. You mentioned the use of the language. Good, very good. So you pointed out lazy, and you see here he's making personification. So he's talking about lazy, but he's talking about the sun. And he's talking about lazy, but he's talking about the moon. So, but it's still not by mistake that he uses that language. So definitely. So I'm talking about what you pointed out as well. You also pointed out the manipulation. So you see that there is a effort on behalf of the author to prompt the reading audience to do something. Is that what you mean when you say he's manipulating? He's maybe talking down, but he's doing it to get you to do something or move. Is that accurate what you said, Jayla?
Yeah, I kind of like sometimes people who are just stuck in a setting and just stuck in like something that they're unhappy with, they just they like settle for just that. And I think there's things around us that make us manipulated into being okay with
Yeah.
what's not okay.
Yeah. Absolutely. So as you said that, I wrote down stuck, settle. So I think he is talking to a group of people that he feel maybe stuck. And when you use the word stuck, look at how he's using the word muddy. So look, when we think about, he said, a man gets his feet set in a sticky mud bank. He's telling the story of somebody who's stuck. So, but when he's talking about them being stuck, he's making many different allusions to what I'll call the Black vernacular, right? So hold on, I'm gonna come back there. You also said, Jayla, taking the easy way. You kind of getting the sense that he's addressing audience members who may, again, feel stuck, may be settling. Perhaps they may have lost that hope that Francis C.W. Harper was talking about. They've now kind of settled. They take the easy road. Right? Is that it? Let me say temps. Okay, yeah. So that's kind of what I'm pulling from that. Did anybody want to add to that? So I guess two ways. How do you see it relating to the slave narrative, and any other figurative meaning you guys were able to pull from the text?
Well, I saw
Also, I'd
that.
like, oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. That's you, Tasha. Go ahead.
I
Yeah.
saw that he was comparing back with the river whispering, lapping against the roots.
Yes, the river. How many times did he bring up the river?
I think twice. I had read it, and I read it twice too.
Yeah. Yeah, he brought that river up. He brought it up twice, but it's a common theme in the poem. So you said, went down to the river, sat me down and listened, heard the water talking quiet like and slow. So he's listening, he's talking about carrying on conversations with the river. If you just sit and you listen, you can hear it talking. What was the other reference to the river? Oh, he said towns are sinking deeper in the riverbank, taking on the ways of their sulky old man, taking on his creepy ways, taking on his evil ways. So the river, allusions that he's making. So we read that Sterling A. Brown is heavily influenced by the blues, gospel, and jazz. We saw that, right? Well, we know that there is a, gospel song, many gospel songs that make this illusion of laying your troubles down by the riverside. You know, if I go to the river, that's kind of where all of my problems can be washed away. Every allusion that he's making to the river is very intentional, and it really speaks to how he was heavily influenced by gospel. He's pulling it in. He's saying that, and here's what I'm wondering if he's saying. You guys tell me this, because I know you had something else you wanted to add, Jayla. But tell me, do you guys see this? He's saying, okay, yeah, maybe back in the past, the river was where we could kind of go and, you know, sit and, you know, perhaps maybe we could get the answers. Perhaps maybe everything could kind of come to us as new. But he's speaking from a perspective like, you guys been sitting too long at the river. You've sat there so long, now you're stuck. So and he's giving us these, again, all of this descriptive, you know, this imagery, right? Man gets his feet set in sticky mud bank. No need for hopping, no need for doing. Muddy streams keep him fixed for good. So that river that you've talked about, or that, let's say if we look in the slave narrative, if we look at the past, if we kind of look at the culture, right? The river symbolically has always meant a place of redemption, a place of, you know, baptism, a place of cleansing and becoming new. But he's saying that, you know, we kind of need to move forward from those thoughts. It needs to not only just be a kind of sitting and waiting to see what the river will tell us, but there needs to be action as well. And I don't know if maybe I'm jumping ahead of what you guys wanted to add about the connection to the slave narrative, but he's making a connection to the slave narrative almost in that he's like, we need to take that narrative a little bit further. The slave narrative put us here, where we focus on overcoming, and we focus on a white audience, and we focus on, you know, kind of detailing our stories on how we've overcome. This poem, to me, tends to meet us at the end of the slave narrative, where we're like, okay, now we've done that. Now it's time for us to do more. We've been kind of stuck with, you know, these old ways. We're becoming a little bit bitter in that what Francis E.W. Harper talked about as hope and happiness and peace. By 1901, when Sterling Brown was born, by the time that this poem was published in 1929, so he's about 30, well, by the time he wrote this, he had seen a lot. So a lot of that hope that his, let's say, mother or his grandmother had held on to, he's kind of seeing that grow stale. And he's like, yeah, we need to move beyond just hoping and kind of being stuck at hope. So the metaphor of the mud is, again, being stuck. But not only that, he also uses the metaphor of mud and muddy to shout out Muddy Waters, the blues singer from Mississippi. So he shouts him out several times in the poem when he says, you know, flood their muddy water round about a man's roots, keep them soaked and stranded and get them weak. He means literally muddy waters. He does mean that, but he's also shouting out, making a nod. There's always a hidden meaning at times at work in African American literature. So I see the nod that he makes, that heavy influence of blues. He brings it up. Even when he says, you know, Little Mary, he's shouting out some of the songs that Muddy Water has made. By talking about Mississippi, when we know he's from Washington, D.C., well, Muddy Waters is from Mississippi, and a lot of the blues artists of that time had kind of derived from that area. So he's very particular in bringing that up. Something else that was brought up, when we think about river, let's look at the river is normally this flow. It can reflect time, it can reflect events, but the way Sterling Brown talked about it in this is it can also overwhelm the weak. So if you are not paying attention, if you are not keeping watch, you may become complacent, is what he's talking about. So yeah, you'll go to the river. Our ancestors always told us to go to the river and pray, go to the river and seek, you know, understanding. He was like, but you need to lift your head up and pay attention to what's going on while you're there, because all of this sitting that we're doing, we're digging deeper and deeper in the riverbank. He says, and in doing so, taking on the ways of the sulky old man. Now, when he says sucky old man, and they capitalize it, I'm thinking he's referring to the master. That's a reference to master. So he's making almost a nod back to the slavery time. Like, if you don't want to go back, then you may definitely want to kind of pay attention to what's happening now. He said, talking about taking on the creepy ways and evil ways. So it's as though he talks about being stuck, but he tells us that we don't need to stay stuck. He gives advice. So there's almost like the slave narrative, there is a moral of the story, right, that he's telling here. So what am I missing, you guys? Help me out. What else did you guys pick up from your own notes, your own reading, that we can add to the discussion? If you look at the advice we got from Francis E.W. Harper, right, all about uplifting and happiness and peace, right? From that time that Francis Harper wrote that, I believe it was like 1895, we stated, from that time, that reflects society, that reflects where they were at that time. Well, for this poem to be written in 1929, it reflects where they were at that time. In 1929, you guys know, historically was the Great Depression. So look at how he talks too about, he brings in those political elements as well, which African-American literature always brings in social and political elements, even if they're telling a story about, let's say, a spider and a horse. Like, it could feel like it has nothing to do, but the moral of the story may still have some rooting in politics. So I know we're almost right at 40, but I'm gonna show you guys this before we leave. He said, went to the water. Oh, no, here's this. Big mules, black loam, apple and peach trees. But seems like the river washes us down past the rich farms, away from the fat lands, dumps us in some ornery riverbank, tongue-tied, dumps us in some ornery riverbank town. Went down to the river, sat me down and listened, heard the water talking quiet like and slow. Ain't no need for hurry. Okay, yeah. So here's what I want you guys to see. He said the river washes down. Okay, so again, he's speaking, there's political elements, past the rich farms, away from the fat lands, and dumps us in some ornery riverbank town. So he's saying, if you're not careful, let me tell you what the river is going to do. It's going to send you downstream. And all of this time, while we're kind of at the river, standing watch, we are being put in, very poor and deplorable situations. They are moving us steadily. And when he's saying us, he's talking about, of course, that Black audience, dumps us in some ornery riverbank town. He is alluding to what happened with the Great Migration and people moving up north, and this hope that, opportunity and the American dream was afforded to everyone. What they found was all they really did was relegate them to certain areas of town with redlining. We saw the emergence of, what people call the, projects or ghetto, but he makes political reference to, they dump us in some ornery riverbank town. This awareness of, you need to put your head up and pay attention to kind of what's going on around to, bypass these ills. So he's giving us advice again of how to overcome. So we see it there. All right, you guys, look, we're right 2 minutes over. So let me go ahead and dismiss. The questions was more so discussion, look, and it was more so, I heard from a few more than others, but I'm still going to make sure you guys all get your credit from being here. Did you guys have any questions for me as far as the homework expectation over the weekend? we're reading, oh snap, before we go, another thing that I'm adding. You guys are reading the Christina Sharp in the Wake, but also in your textbook. You know, do we have our anthologies, or are you guys utilizing that link that I believe it was Natalie left in the last class? Do you guys have the text? Look, I always laugh at my son when I'm kind of sitting in the back while his teacher is